Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. The conventional thinking about disinformation is that it is spread by bots. Today, though, research finds that we are unwittingly the ones spreading disinformation. It's us. We certainly aren't out there necessarily creating it, but research shows that we are the ones that are responsible for false information amplification. And so we want to help so this can stop. I'm Dr. Temple Northup, the director of the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State University. Our media school is bringing you today's webinar with a lot of help from our friends. This session is co-hosted by the San Diego Union Tribune in partnership with iNewsSource, the San Diego Public Library System, and San Diego chapters for the Association of Black Journalists and Public Relations Society of America. This is the first of 5 Disinfecting Disinformation webinars this month that we'll offer. Today's webinar opens up a conversation between a journalist and a citizen activist. From each perspective, we will hear about how disinformation is a targeted attack on citizens in an attempt to persuade. We'll hear how they each stand up to disinformation and push back. You will walk away with at least 3 practical tips on how to spot, stop, and debunk information. We encourage you to share your outtakes from today on social media. Please use our hashtag disinfectingdisinfo or tag @SDUT and @SDSU_JMS to join in the conversation. Our panel starts as a moderated conversation, and then we'll open up to questions. So that we can cover as many topics as possible, we aren't going to spend a lot of time introducing each panelist. As you have questions, just type them into the Q&A box. Our moderator today is Dr. Nathian Shae Rodriguez. Dr. Nate, as we call him, is an assistant professor teaching media studies in the School of Journalism and Media Studies at SDSU. Dr. Nate will be leading the conversation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Nate.
Thank you, Dr. Northup. Yes, so my pronouns are he, him, el, and I will be serving as your moderator today. I do want to quickly just point out some great information about our 2 panelists today. Ashley Bryant, she is a principal at AB Partners with over 12 years in brand building, digital marketing, and political strategy. She sits at the intersection of cultural change, politics, and technology, and leads the political campaign practice, helping organizations develop meaningful digital engagement to invite participation in social justice and politics to create new narratives. She is co-leading the Win Back Bylante campaign. Also on the panel today, we have Matthew T. Hall. He is the editorial and opinion director at the San Diego Union Tribune, where he has worked since 2001. He manages the ideas and opinion section, writing and editing editorials and overseeing editorial cartoons, commentaries, letters to the editor, and a podcast named Name Drops San Diego. He is also a University of New Hampshire graduate, president-elect, well actually now he is the president of the Society of Professional Journalists and past president of the San Diego chapter of SPJ. So welcome to both of our panelists. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I want to start off by citing the 2020 IPR Disinformation in Society report, which says that over 61% of individuals are concerned about misinformation, down from 65% in 2019, and 58% are concerned about disinformation. Now, we heard Dr. Temple Northup tell us that it's not just the bots that are out there spreading misinformation and disinformation, but human beings themselves. So what can we do? That's the opening question I will ask for both of you. How do we see these 2 different groups, journalists and citizen organizations, or organizations as a whole, working together? Is there cohesion? Is there tension? What are the main challenges and implications of this?
Sure. I'm happy to start, if that's okay, Matt.
Go for it.
Great. Well, one, thank you all for having me. I think I'm incredibly grateful for you all hosting something like this, especially with this subject matter. And to your question, Nate, the dangers of this, it is quite dangerous to spread misinformation and disinformation. And so what I typically ask of folks is to take a pause, to exercise restraint, as you are scrolling your timelines or seeing folks, even friends and family, sharing different articles and different pieces of content. Because what we're hoping is that inherently we will start to learn to spot this misinfo and disinformation, similar to how we can typically look down at our phone and know if it's actually someone you know or it's a telemarketer, right? We've learned over the years the different tricks, the mirroring your home area code, right? And so, it's really about, there's a couple ways. One, looking at if people are actually talking about themselves as individuals, right? Most of the time, think about how you consume or even participate in social media channels. It's very unlikely that you're only going to get on social media and talk about one topic and one topic only. And so a lot of these bad actors or even foreign agents or bots, if you go through their timeline, they are simply drilling home this one political or very extreme narrative. And that typically shows you that this is not an individual person. There's not a human being behind this information that you're seeing. And so checking these profiles and also leaning on credible sources. While we know that our media and journalists are highly biased, I'm not going to pretend that they aren't. But if you aren't seeing credible journalists and media reporting on the same types of content, on the same types of stories, then again, it's very likely that it is false. And so I think, really this all comes from exercising some of that restraint. And Nate, you stole my thunder with some of those stats, to be quite honest. But I'll throw one in there, is thinking about that 65% that is thinking about misinformation and disinformation affecting our elections. But there's only 27% of people that actually say that they exercise restraint. Right. And so, we want to make sure that before you just hit retweet, before you share something, before you're sending it to a family group chat or a friend group chat, we really want folks diving in and saying, is this true? Is this factual? And checking those profiles, because it is dangerous. Misinformation and disinformation is voter suppression. It is highly targeted to Black and Latinx voters. We just saw earlier this week the expose of the 2016 Trump campaign trying to dissuade 3.5 million Black Americans to not vote. That is voter suppression. And they did that through a disinformation campaign. And so it's not just, I tweeted something that may or may not be true, but this is what's going to decide our election. This is what's deciding the leaders that are creating policies that are very impactful for our communities. And so we have to exercise that restraint to protect our democracy.
Thank you. There's a lot of information there. I want to unpack a lot of those specific points that you did. But before we do that, I want to go to Matthew and ask you the same thing. How do we see this tension, this cohesion between journalists and community active groups?
The reality is the definition of a journalist is anyone with a smartphone in this day and age, because if you have a phone and are walking past anything, you can document it, you can upload it. And social media is the great equalizer. So whether you are a journalist who works for the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, or you are, someone who prefers to use TikTok because you're 14 and you happen to also have a Twitter account and you share something, it potentially could go viral. It could be reached by a lot of people. So at the outset, we're all journalists. Now, that said, journalists, real journalists, have training. We have practice in the field. We have mentors. We have a code of ethics that the Society of Professional Journalists has, which emphasizes seek the truth and report it, which are two different things. You have to find the story and then make sure it's publishable. And also minimize harm, which means minimize harm to yourself as the journalist, to your institution or outlet, to the sources and subjects you write about. And there is that little bit of conflict, right? If you're interviewing the mayor, you don't have to kind of go through the same process. If you're interviewing a voter who is explaining to you some problem that they may have encountered and maybe doesn't understand where their story is going to go and how it could kind of become a big issue. And so you really need to do what you do any day in anything, is treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, right? So that's easy as you're reporting a story. It's quite something else when you're talking to someone who's lying to you, who's misrepresenting the truth or the facts. In 2016, truthiness was our fear. And now we have deep fake videos that you can't even tell if they're legitimate or if they're mass produced, as Ashley was saying, for a nefarious purpose for voter suppression, to keep Black voters or brown voters away from the polls, which is real and is something to worry about. I would just say, anytime we have a conversation about the election, especially now, I like to start at the top by saying the notion of an election day is no longer the case, right? Americans will be voting for a month before the election, totally normal, totally part of the process. More of us will be getting vote by mail ballots that we will then have to return, either at a voting station in person or via the mail. But that's all part of the process. That's legally legitimate, routine, and after the election, election night is no longer a thing. So results will take days and weeks to come in, and that again is normal, part of the process, routine, to be expected. So when you hear someone like the President of the United States cast doubt on that system, he is telling you a story and trying to influence the election in ways that Ashley just said, to keep you from voting, to keep people from voting. Now that's a huge problem. So I would just tell everyone here today that the tricks to recognize misinformation and disinformation are out there. We will share some with you today. They're real. You got to take them to heart, because people are trying to pull the wool over your eyes in a way to keep you from knowing the truth. And that is a huge, huge problem.
So let's kind of build on this, because we did have a question that was asking specifically in the Q&A about Trump leading the disinformation for what's happening now. And I want to go back and touch on the Vanity Fair article that Ashley brought up, where Donald Trump's campaign created a digital strategy to deter 3.5 million African Americans from showing up at the polls. They write, voter suppression has long been a tactic used specifically to target Black voters. Historically, it was poll taxes, then Jim Crow laws in the early 1920s through the 1960s. Yet Black Americans continue to disproportionately encounter suppression and barriers to voting across the country. So let's talk about this disenfranchised voter, the Black and the brown and the indigenous. How do we see misinformation and disinformation being targeted to them specifically, and what are those implications?
I'll defer to you, Ashley.
Okay. The weaponization of digital media has evolved over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. And Nate, you're exactly right. This is another tactic in the line of literacy tests, of poll taxes, of every tactic that has been thrown at people of color to disenfranchise our communities and keep us away from participating in this democracy. This is not a partisan issue. Voter suppression is not a partisan issue. We should, as the United States, want every single eligible voter to vote. And I even use eligible lightly, to be quite honest, because we could talk for hours about the voter ID laws and the hoops that you have to go through to cast your ballot in every election cycle. And so, it's something that should have everyone's attention. It shouldn't be a progressive program. I shouldn't have to have Win Black Palante, quite honestly. It's disappointing that even the party isn't taking on this issue in the way that they should. We should be making sure that we're holding platforms accountable. One thing that came out of that article this week, the Channel 4 expose, that I think isn't getting enough attention, quite honestly. We can focus on Trump's campaign all day long, but no one is surprised, or let me stop. I'm not surprised that these are racist tactics that were used by his campaign. But what I am surprised is that no one is actually saying, Facebook, how dare you? How dare you hide behind not being able to, quote unquote, share this private data when you enabled voter suppression towards 3.5 million Black Americans? That is disgusting. It's something that we shouldn't stand for, and it's something that someone needs to get on the Senate floor and be talking about this. And so when we talk about having a democracy that is representative of our true representation of Americans from every corner of this state, or excuse me, of this country, that is making sure that people of color can be a part of civic participation. And disinformation campaigns are directly targeting Black and brown voters. We're seeing it every single day. With Win Black Palante, we have a war room every morning where we're exploring what are these hot button issues. We just came out of Project Veritas a few days ago, targeting Minnesota with doctored videos, really trying to target some of the congressional members in Minnesota, coming for our grassroots organizers who are doing the work on the ground to make sure folks can show up in this election and have their voices heard. These are coordinated attacks that are not just foreign agents. Media, I feel as though journalists love to talk about Russian interference or foreign interference, but we don't talk enough about the folks that are right next door to us that are coordinating efforts to attack the Black and brown vote, and not just in presidential cycles. We're in an uprising right now. We're in a moment where we need to transform policies in every state across this country. And that doesn't just start with the presidential election. That starts with our local elections. That starts with county prosecutors, district attorneys, councilmen, councilwomen. And so we have to be vigilant across all of our election cycles, but we can only do that if we get everyone that is eligible to vote. And these disinfo campaigns are directly attacking our right to vote.
Thank you so much for that. And you said so much there and so much information, especially
I'm sorry, I keep going.
Well, no, this is what this conversation is about.
It's a hot button. It's a hot button. So I'm gonna keep coming with it.
No, and it should continue to be a hot button, because voter suppression for marginalized communities continues to be an issue, and that happens over and over again. And I do want to piggyback off of that and address Sally's question here. Maybe Matthew, you can help us with this. Her question, or her statement was, is it correct that Trump is leading the dissemination of misinformation, disinformation? I don't know if that source is correct. So in essence, Sally is asking us, she's fact checking. When you see these different sources, specifically when it's aimed at Black and brown and indigenous people, how specifically for a journalist, right, do you go about verifying these sources so that you can then be very much more truthful and specific about this disinformation that's happening towards this specific population, or I guess in the population in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think verifying information is at the root of what a journalist does, right? So anytime you see or hear or read something, you need to verify whether it's accurate, right? And so that doesn't change because we're in an election cycle or because it's a heated environment where there's, politicians who are attacking the media, calling people the enemy of the free, the free press, the enemy of the people. But I will say this. I mean, fake news is neither news nor new. The term has been around since the 1800s. Politicians have used it for decades and centuries. And so Donald Trump did not invent that. He is not the only person to use it. So, the questioner is correct in that there are other people who have seen an opportunity to attack the media in this moment. Here in San Diego, Congressman Duncan Hunter, until the very end, was criticizing the Union Tribune for fake news. Now we all know that, of course, that reporting was so legitimate that he is no longer in the halls of Congress. So I will say that reporting needs to be accurate. That standard doesn't change because we're in an election cycle, but more people are paying attention, right? I think it was 50 or 60 million people watched Tuesday's debate, which is tens of millions of people, you know what I mean, who are drawing conclusions in real time based on what both of those politicians were saying. I mean, the interesting thing about the 2016 election was that never in the history of journalism had more resources been devoted in real time to fact checking both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And the reality was she lied. She lied some, let's be honest. He lied a lot. He won. So it didn't matter to people that we were telling you in real time that what he said or she said was wrong. So I think there was a reality check that we all came out of 2016 with. And I don't know if we're implementing it a better approach in 2020. There's only a month left in this election, but I do think that there are efforts to let people know, not just this is what we think, but here's how you should determine. Like that's the disconnect, I think, last time around that needs to change this and has changed. People need to be empowered to know what's real. And it is not an easy thing to do. People don't have the time. They don't have, in some cases, the ability or the training to know what's real and what's not. So it's a huge, huge problem. And it's not going to go away when Donald Trump leaves the presidency. That problem will continue.
Very much so. Thank you so much.
Nate, if I can, and Matthew, thank you for that. I think I plus to everything that you just said. I really want to underscore here, because I think the term fake news diminishes some of this disinformation that we're seeing, right? You know, candidates often are, you know, misquoting stats or policies or their accomplishments or things like that. But when what we're up against in these times, we're talking about a pandemic. We're talking about not giving folks the real factual evidence that we were actually facing a pandemic. We were facing something that folks were eventually, and now we're up to over 200,000 deaths. We faced an administration that lied around a virus, right? We are facing disinformation campaigns that in 2016 were telling people they could text in their vote, right? They are telling people, they are targeting them with ads saying, you can text this number and cast your vote. They dissuaded people and told them that the election day was on a different date. So I just want to make sure that as we talk about the things that we're tackling, there's a difference between fact checking, right? There's a difference between misquoting policies or misquoting what their accomplishments and their record, and then lying to the American people that, and when it comes to their health, protecting their families, and being participating in this democracy. And so I just want to make sure, as for the viewers, Matthew, I know you know, right? But I think that I want to make sure that we aren't diminishing that in any way, because there is a difference here between fake news, but actually lying to the American people about their livelihood, their health, and being able to participate in this election.
Thank you so much for that clarification, because it is a line that needs to be distinguished between even misinformation and disinformation, right? The intentionality is there to suppress those votes.
Absolutely.
And information out there. So thank you for that. I do want to touch on something that Matt said, and you used the term empowering. And so empowering individuals to take the agency to fact check themselves, to take the agency to look for sources, but also to tell their own stories. And I think storytelling is one of those things that has become essential. People speaking up, using their own voice in the opinion section of newspapers. Ashley, I know with your site, Win Black and Palante, which Palante itself is an empowering Spanish word to go forward and go forth. So how do you feel digital storytelling helps craft new narratives about people, specifically Black, Indigenous, other people of color, to kind of amplify the people, instigate power and social change during this era of disinformation?
Absolutely, and I appreciate this question so much, because quite honestly, you know, our firm, AB Partners, was created for this purpose, right? We are often, and we saw this year around, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, and all these agencies and corporations are just now trying to find minority talent. And for us, it was really important to center an agency with a diverse group of folks that have lived the experiences of communities that are representative of our entire country, to be able to tell our stories, right? We work with progressive organizations, nonprofit organizations, even some corporate clients, and our entire purpose is to help them think about their messaging, their narrative, and being able to uplift stories of the often disenfranchised, which are people of color, but we are an agency built from those stories, built from those people. And so it's incredibly important that we are centering storytelling, not just in this moment, but as we are talking to our audiences and our as we think about, you know, the media and journalists and being able to reach out to the folks to authentically share what is happening in the fabric of this country, really showing, you know, the needle of we aren't really the minority. I hate using, you know, I hate using that term, right? But it's quite true, and that's what we're sensing is that fear, that the white majority is no longer truly the majority, and we shouldn't have a fear. It should be that we can weave together as Americans, right? And so it's so important to be able to center these stories with the diverse nature of the folks that really make up who we are as you know, as a country.
Thank you for
So
that.
that's actually
new storytelling.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's an important point, and what you're starting to see, and it's a conversation that's happened for years, is the importance of language, right? And how you present that language. So, you know, since the killing of George Floyd, you're seeing a lot of newsrooms, including ours, decide to capitalize Black. In our case, we also capitalize Brown and we capitalize white, to show that when you're talking about race, handling all of them appropriately by capitalizing them. Also, you brought up the word minority, Ashley. My section no longer uses that word. I would prefer communities of color, because minority is an othering term, it's a lessering term, and it's pretty soon going to be an inaccurate term, right? And so I think along those lines, storytelling, to your direct point, Nate, is so important. And who tells stories, who's featured in stories, those have always been huge questions for journalism. It used to be that journalism was largely the domain of old white guys. And as an oldish, I'm not gonna go old, I'll say oldish, as an oldish white guy, I understand that. And one of the things that the Union Tribune has been doing starting this year is we're sharing our demographic data, both at a staff and management level, with our audience, because it's important that they know who's telling those stories, who is in positions of leadership at a company, and then they can chart over time our improvements toward diversifying that, because diversity is a reflection of a community, right? It's how you better serve your community if it better reflects the community. I'm not talking about checking boxes. I'm talking about having the kind of cultural competency and understanding to tell stories, you know, not because you need to cover a Black Lives Matter protest if you're the Black reporter on a staff, but it's you are able to understand and appreciate and tell that story better than a person who's coming, like myself, from a place of white privilege. So the diversity of newsrooms is a big conversation that's taking place now. It's too late. You know, this industry, like many industries and institutions, is dealing with the systemic racism that's been a problem for so long. And I think it'll ultimately get us to a better place. But when you talk about election coverage, it's a big deal for all the issues Ashley talked about of voter suppression of certain communities. You need to have those communities on your staff so that you can tell those stories from a different perspective.
Absolutely, right. So it's not just about diversity, but also inclusion, right? Equity,
Correct.
representation, all that needs to
Correct.
come together for that. Yes. So I going back to this, you know, looking at the media as a place where people go to further information, sometimes going away from that, right? First, let's look at the media holistically. Citing that same 2020 IPR disinformation report, over 70% of overall respondents said they had some trust, just some trust, in local broadcast TV news, and 60% trust local newspapers. So how do we go about combating this distrust, especially when people then go to Facebook, go to social media, these other spaces? How do we, as a society, collectively, combat that distrust?
Yeah, huge question, and in many ways the question, right, for media and for newspapers in particular, where you know, there's no question our readership is going like this, our advertising is even a steeper decline. And so one of the things that I think the best outlets will do, and how you can tell a reputable outlet from a lesser one, is it's the notion of audience is foundational. It's not a one-way street. Here's our news stories. Let us know. Oh, we made a mistake. We'll fix it in 24 hours when the next edition comes out, right? These aren't like stone tablets. This is a two-way street, a conversation that doesn't end, that involves members of the public. So at the Union Tribune, we have a community advisory board that tells us when we get it wrong, that gives us kind of line of sight into communities, geographic, ethnic, varieties of gender, that help us tell those stories better. We also just started a Community Voices project because, again, it's not our view of the world, it's the community's view of the world. So we have 60 people that can write about anything they want, at any length they want, at any time they want. And it's been well received, and it's a huge, huge part of this. And I think that, to your point, to your question, Nate, is how the media rebuilds that trust. There's no question we have done things disastrously as an industry, starting with giving away our content for free on the internet. That was a bad decision. Then it's a worse decision in hindsight. But again, so it's not about, and so I think once we have that trust and communal discussion, then with a clear conscience, we can go to folks and say, look, we're not asking you to subscribe to us. We're asking you to help make your community better, because a strong newspaper makes for a strong community. A strong news website and public radio station and television stations make for a strong community, right? So that is where the conversation needs to get. And to your original question about journalists versus citizens, like in many ways, we're in this fighting for the same things, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of overlap there.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no, he said it.
Yeah, so there, I mean, so it's not always tension, there's also cohesion, working together, there's a common goal, working towards that. So I do want to go to a question that kind of falls into the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which was social media. And we talked about it a little bit, you know, Facebook and the algorithms. Ashley, you said we should be holding Facebook as accountable as anyone else. So James says, I watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, and was reminded that the algorithms for Facebook and Twitter amplify controversial posts and tweets. How does disinformation play into the fear that tech giants are making our republic more divisive?
Absolutely. Thank you, James, wherever you are. But they are. And, you know, I think, and I actually just saw someone in the chat that talked about without legal and financial, thank you, Angie, without legal and financial repercussions, it will continue. And that's exactly right. I mean, and I wish that I had some secret sauce here. But I don't. I think, you know, one of my most disappointed feelings in this year has been the lack of accountability. I'm seeing it from every angle. I'm seeing it from the political angle. I'm seeing it as a user, right? I can see the echo chamber that is created around me, and I've contributed to it. I work for an agency. I've worked for several different agencies. I was in the private sector many years ago, even at P&G, selling shampoo, right? And so, you know, it's a lucrative business, right? And it's tough to really talk about our democracy in the same conversation as business, right? But it's the truth, the same way that unfortunately candidates can only be viable by the number of money that they raise, right? And so this platform accountability piece is really detrimental to our elections, to who can participate in this election. There's a lot of great organizations that are working to hold platforms accountable. Our organization also, we have flagged several instances where we've seen bots, we've seen coordinated attacks on Facebook where we've escalated that to their executive team. You know, Twitter had a bold move, you know, this year, actually saying they just weren't going to do any political advertising, but they're still, you know, Matthew, you started this panel talking about everyone's a journalist, right? All of us think that we are the valid source for all information. And so every tweet can be seen as the Bible. And that is, you know, that's something that it's tough, right? It's tough to manage, but the same way that they created these algorithms to be so effective, they can also fix them. They can also monitor these bots that are taking over. They can monitor these coordinated attacks. For example, in 2016, there was a Facebook group called Blacktivists that amassed a following larger than Color of Change, larger than the NAACP. They had millions of Black Americans on this Facebook page, and they cultivated a relationship pretending to be a Black activist in the streets. and talked about the issues and cultural matters that are really resonant with Black folks. And then when it came time to the election, they amassed and they turned that messaging into, you know what, none of these candidates are for us. Let's band together and not vote. And that is, I mean, that actually took a large voting bloc out of participating in the 2016 election. And it didn't take a group of scientists to figure out that this was not a person, not a group, not a grassroots organization, and Facebook let it ride, and they're letting it ride today. And so it really does have to get into our administration in a way that Facebook has to be held accountable. We have to have some repercussions here. We have to stop funding Facebook in a lot of ways, but it's gonna take a coordinated effort, and it's gonna take some policy change that's gonna be uncomfortable for us. People are gonna think it's censorship, but it has to be done.
Thank you. And I want to ask your opinion also, Matt, and also interject a question on top of that, asking, because this deals specifically with journalism, we see journalists doing this too, but do you also feel that companies like Facebook, Twitter, these social media companies should declare that their content is not fact-based and require them to adopt the same kind of differentiation between reporting and commentary that was pioneered by journalism professionals?
I mean, I think this is a super complicated issue. There's freedom of speech issues. You know, America prides itself. It's literally in the First Amendment on letting people say what you want. Now that comes with consequences. If you say something that you shouldn't at a job, you can lose your job. So I do think Ashley is right that these social media companies, and it's not just those social media companies, I mean, they're the biggest companies on the planet, right? So it's Facebook and it's Amazon, or not Amazon, but Apple and Google. I guess maybe, you know, so those are the big three, right? And I think it's so easy for anyone who's name checked the documentary that is on everyone's lips and everyone's watching that on Netflix, The Social Dilemma. It's so easy to serve up information in these platforms without a lot of accountability. Now, anyone who thinks that Facebook just exists so that you can share your pictures of your kids with your grandparents, nah, they're trying to make money. They want to make money. They want to share information. That's their goal. And we, as an editorial board at the Union Tribune, have editorialized quite a bit, actually, that they should be more accountable, that they should have the same way. If you have a political ad on television, you can do a deep dive and you can find out who paid for it, what the ad buy is, chase some money. With Facebook, you cannot do that as easily. And they should be held to the same system because it's more prominent. And the way that micro-targeting works with a campaign, that's how campaigns are won or lost, by dog owners in Pacific Beach, right? That's how elections are won or lost these days. And if you don't realize that, you should, because that's how local elections are being done. And so huge, it's so complicated, it's hard to know how to start it. California is kind of ahead of the curve. We have a data privacy law that may or may not get changed in November, but it kind of is mirrored off the European data privacy law. And so people should be mindful of what they're giving away when they click through a button on a legal form that they did not read on some of these things. And I don't read them either. I think there's a generational thing that takes place where older people are more protective of their data. My kids use TikTok all the time, and despite my best warnings and efforts, are not as protective of their data as they should and will be later. But all of these issues need to come to the fore, and I'm hoping that there'll be some leadership in Congress to take some action, because as Ashley said, that's where the rubber hits the road. These companies are not going to voluntarily give up some of their power and some of their money.
Very much so. Thank you for that. We have two questions about confirmation bias. One of them's in the chat. It says, our news is only as accurate and objective as the sources we use. How do you know seems to be lacking these days? Too much confirmation bias. And then Julie asked in the questions, what, if anything, can be done about confirmation bias?
That's huge. Yeah, I'll take this one first, Ashley, just because I really care about this one deeply. Journalists, it used to be objectivity was the kind of guiding light for journalists, which is tough for a lot of reasons now, mainly because social media makes it so easy for us to share our opinions in ways that regular journalists shouldn't, and that opinion journalists such as myself probably do too much. But knowing your own biases and your own blind spots has never been more important. It's always been important, but it's never been more important when the trust in media is collapsing. And so what does that mean? How do you know your own biases? You can still, like, being open with people, being transparent, like transparency is the new objectivity. So you can care deeply about something and still report on it as long as you're upfront with people. If you have a bias that completely takes you out, like you are, a member of some organization and there's a financial arrangement, clearly you should not be doing journalism on that subject. But being open with people, super important. And confirmation bias is a thing. I tell students all the time when they ask me, like, I ask them about their media diet, not only the platforms, newspaper versus radio versus podcast versus digital email versus social media, but the spectrum, right? So I think you should know that all media outlets are being engaged on two things right now, like where you are on political spectrum on bias, right, from right to left, and then also where you are in terms of your competency and your quality. So you should be high quality, no minimal bias, right? So that's like AP and Reuters and a European magazine called The Economist. Like those hit the sweet spot. And then as you go, you have magazines and newspapers and others that are more to one side or the political spectrum and are upfront about it. And that's okay, as long as you know if they understand where they're coming from and you can track their money. Like you should know who owns the Union Tribune, who owns whatever magazine or outlet you're reading, and how active they are. Like those are questions that's like basic default questions everyone should ask of their media. Like, so I would answer it that way by saying, yeah, bias exists. You got to acknowledge it. You got to acknowledge when you have too much of it, then you should not be involved in those kind of stories.
Thank you. Ashley, anything on confirmation bias?
I would just heavily plus that. I love that you are really centering it with the individual, because that's exactly what I was going to say. I think, similar to what I said earlier in like the restraint, right? It's just a lot of this and unfortunately, we have to take more onus on ourselves, and recognizing that we have to inform and educate ourselves a lot more in this day and age. We can't just sit in front of a television and think that we're learning about the news from all angles, right? It's just not going to happen. And so again, just underscoring everything that you said, Matt, it really does take a lot more work on our front, but it's worth it.
Thank you both for that. And I think this segues nicely into the next question that we have from an anonymous attendee who really talks about, the issue of news, but also individuals that consume the news, and we go back and forth. And this person writes, I go back and forth with family and friends who are convinced that Fox News is fair and balanced. They portray the facts. My friends and family remind me always that my news sources are not factual and are false and are a hoax. I rely on the New York Times, PBS NewsHour, and many other sources, mostly international. Any suggestions on how to engage with my Fox News enthusiasts? Do I give up engaging with them? Am I stuck? I do not know how to move forward with people. I care about who sees the facts fundamentally differently than I do. Please advise.
Gosh, I'm like, whoo. Okay. Let me make sure. Let me put my diplomatic hat on. I think actually, I'm going to take more of like a mental safe space with this question, to be quite honest, because I think this year has been an awakening on a lot of fronts. And the first thing I would honestly say is like, it's not worth the argument. Quite honestly, it's not worth trying to convince folks if they are stuck in their behavior, right? And I actually talk about this when people say, well, how can I combat misinformation? And a lot of folks will spend hours in the comments on Facebook or in replies on Twitter. And I always say, if you're arguing, it's not worth it. It is never actually worth it. It's one thing, if someone is willing to receive your point of view, your perception. If they are blocking receiving that, it is not worth your time or your space. You are not going to change that person's belief. But what you can do is on your channels for what you believe to be true and factual is to be spreading that actual information in hopes that some folks will absorb it and understand. And so we talk about this in like countering misinformation. In our program, we don't repost something and say that it's false. We don't call attention to something and say that it's false. But what we do is we work with our partners into building this echo chamber of news that is true, of the narratives that we know are true and are resonant. And so even as individuals, I tell folks, don't waste the argument. Don't waste having to change the perceptions of the folks around you, but you have a responsibility to share the articles and the news that you know that are actually true and that will help to educate folks. And so I would put your energy into that versus trying to change the hearts and minds of the folks around you that are just unmoved.
Yeah, that's interesting. I tell my teammates all the time, you can get in a 5-minute Twitter fight, or you can spend 5 minutes doing journalism. Do the journalism, right? So I do agree. I agree with that. But I also say that I think there's a nuance here. I think a lot of people didn't see Trump's victory coming in 2016. Our editorial board wrote an editorial in February that said, "Stop saying Trump can't win. He can, and here's why." And of course, all the things we said came true. And the day after the election, you know, I made it a point to follow more journalists in the middle of the country, you know, journalists across the political spectrum, to kind of expand my worldview. Like, I already thought that I was kind of plugged in, but you never plugged in enough. And so I would just urge, to the specific question, have these conversations are not bad or difficult conversations, whether you're approaching life from a conservative or liberal viewpoint and want to talk to someone on the other side. Those conversations should be had. This country would be in a healthier place if we could have those conversations. The problem is, it's more, this is my way, why aren't you joining me? You know, rather than listen. We can all do more listening, I think. Ashley's totally right that if someone's having a serious conversation and willing to be receptive, and if they're not, don't feel bad about muting those trolls. You know, I used to say feed the trolls. Now I'm like, don't even bother. Mute them. Your life, your safe, your mental health, especially in this pandemic, you know, especially in the conversations that are kind of around the country right now. Your mental health comes first. Take care of yourself. Have these conversations as they come. Expand your view. Read people on the other side. There are smart people all over this country on, you know, whatever the political spectrum is. You can find some smart people who will help you understand what they're saying. Because one of the points that I want to make is, we were very, very critical of Donald Trump in last year's primary, so much so that our editorial board, when he was the only candidate in the California Republican primary, endorsed Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan would have been a better person to uphold Republican ideals, even dead, than Donald Trump, right? So we do not pull any punches, but we also want to make an important distinction. We do not criticize all of his supporters, right? Tens of millions of people voted for Donald Trump, many of them because they felt left out or left behind. So it's important to realize that there are a lot of people in this country who wanted something different, who need to be part of this conversation. And so if we can have that conversation in a healthy way, let's do it. But Tuesday was clearly not a healthy discussion, anything but. And so I don't know how we make that happen at that level. It starts with, I think, some changes with the way those debates are handled, and killing the mic on the president of the United States, as sad as that is to have to say. But to the point of Fox, you know, Chris Wallace is a really good journalist. He was in over his head, and he kind of got, you know, swept by this Trump wave of bad manners, to put it mildly.
I think a lot of us feel that way. A lot of us feel over our heads. And thank you both for elevating mental health, because, you know, as a queer person of color, you know, in my community, Mexican American community, mental health isn't something that we just freely, openly talk about. And I think right now, during the pandemic, during, you know, the 2020 election year, mental health is something that should be, I think, elevated to the forefront of conversations as well. I want to continue with the resources here. We have two questions. The first one comes from Stephanie. She says, as a non-student majoring in journalism and wanting to stick with non-fake news, which unbiased articles should one look up to? And then we have another question, sort of the same, from Jennifer, that says, what sources do you suggest for further reading or exploration? Calling bullshit the Institute for Public Relations, Society of Professional Journalists, and of course, the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State University are my go-tos, but I know I'm missing some good ones. So what resources do both of you have for our attendees?
I can start here. I would say I've been leaning on universities as well. I think that I've actually seen some really good research coming out of universities around mis and disinformation, but also especially in the pandemic. I think our educational institutions have done a really good job of, and because there's an quite honestly, there's more of a liability for our for our universities, for their students to actually spread the correct information around COVID and things that are impacting students. And so I would say continue on following the universities that you have connections with, or obviously we have some of the well known for just folks across the country. And then there's actually, research institutions have been doing a really good job of doing some of this analysis around whether it's, the election and platform and issues and things like that. So there's a research firm called GQR. Media Matters has been doing some great work. There's also a firm called First Draft. And this is if you like to comb through some reporting. I mean, these aren't necessarily news, but they do have like these, thought leadership pieces that really help like break down different policies or different like current events and things. And it's much more from a technical standpoint, which is where, a great place to toe the line there. So you're not getting opinion, you're getting a lot more fact-based information if you're looking at some of these research sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good a start. I would say, there are really good fact checkers out there. PolitiFact is a good on the Washington Post's fact checking team is solid as well. Daniel Dale, who used to be at the Toronto Star, he was their Washington bureau chief, is now at CNN. Is a tour de force of fact checking. You can do it in real time. But I would say as much as knowing where to turn to fact check is knowing how to do it yourself, right? So just some real quick tips to help everyone in no particular order. Check the URL. If it says cbs.com.co, that is not cbs.com. It's an easy way to fake news and get misinformation out there. Check the date of your story. Some of these issues that are so controversial and so kind of complicated, immigration, racial justice, or people's positions have maybe changed over the years. It's easy to share a piece from 10 years ago and say it's now, and it's not. So check the date, check the URL, check your source. If you're turning to a website, they should have an About Us section where you can figure out what they do, what their mission is. Each writer should have an email address where you can send them a note and correspond with them. If you have a problem, they will listen to you. They should have a bio page that lists their credentials, whether it's academic or awards or expertise. Know if it's satire, know if it's opinion. Like these are all things that we all need to do better. Kind of like, Ashley was saying, the onus is really, it's on us, as news consumers to know what we're doing. And reputable news sites will go out of the way to tell you that it's reputable. They will have links, not only to other stories in their website, but to other outlets. Yeah, it's competitive, but we're also trying to give you the facts. If we write about a court document, you know what, we'll link to the court document so you can read it yourself. If we have an image with a story, we'll go to great lengths for it not to be leading. So it won't have, everyone remembers that famous, was it Time or Newsweek, the O.J. Simpson cover where they darkened his face. What a terrible, terrible thing. So, we go to great lengths to make sure that the coverage is fair, that down to the word choice, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times on Deadline, my team is like, uh-oh, this is the wrong word. We have 30 seconds. What do we do? So all those techniques will help all of us kind of get to a better place. But Ashley's right when she said it's work. It is not easy to do this work, but it's essential.
It's very essential, and thank you both for doing the work and being here with us today. Our time with each other is coming to an end, and I know there's been so much that we talked about and so much more that we can talk about. Even, Matthew's last comment there talks, goes into the conversation on media literacy and digital literacy. So right now, I just want to say thank you both. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kay Sweetser, who is going to give us some closing remarks and tie us all together. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this webinar today. We really appreciate all that we learned from Dr. Nate and Ashley and Matthew. Make sure you check out the chat, because we've been sharing a lot of the links to the stories that they were telling in there, and we have been doing a lot on social media using the hashtag Disinfecting Disinfo. You know, it is more evident than ever that fighting disinformation is a really big job, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. It was just said, this is work. Let's get to work. The good news is that you can make a difference. Remember how at the beginning, our school director, Dr. Temple Northrup, mentioned that the research says that us, not bots, are the biggest spreaders of disinformation? Well, then we have the power to stop it. Matthew went over some great tips, and we have tweeted those out and also put them in the chat. But just kind of recap some of the general ones are, when you see something questionable online, verify that information through a quick Google search. If the content is meant to create a division, chances are today that's disinformation. And so you might want to step away from that. Keep your own social media squeaky clean from disinformation and resist that urge to share. So if you missed part of the webinar today, or you just want to watch it again, that's going to be me, we're going to send out the playback video for you tomorrow, so you'll get it in your inbox. This is a webinar series, and our next Disinfecting Disinformation webinar is on October 6th. That happens to be the day after ballots are sent out in the state of California, and it's going to be at noon Pacific time. I'm going to toss the registration link in the chat box, and I hope that you guys will all join us for that. It's going to be fantastic. All right, let's get that in the chat box. There you go. We, of course, are a school that is based in continual improvement, and so we really want to know what you thought about the webinar. And you're going to get a survey, so I really hope you take a moment to fill it out and tell us how we can be better. If you think of ways that the School of Journalism and Media Studies can really lead the fight in this, well, then we are all ears and ready to jump in. So thank you so much for your time. I'll make sure that the links got into the webinar there, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ashley and Nate. I learned a lot from you guys.
Thank
Same.
you.
Thank you. This is great.
Pa'lante, Ashley. Pa'lante,
Yes,
Matt.
Palante. Have a good
See you guys.
Take care.
Adios.